Welcome to if Gran Turismo Sports online gameplay is truly repetitive. Something that I've said for as long as I can remember is it's perfectly fine to have repetition for the sake of competition, meaning doing the same thing over and over, whether driving a certain car, or a certain track, or a certain settings, or a combination of all of it, is perfectly fine if you're purposely trying to get better at whatever you're doing, and that applies for more than just Gran Turismo Sport. That's a lot of things. Practice makes as close as you can get to perfect as possible. I don't really believe in the practice makes perfect moniker. It's as close as you can get to perfect, or as close as you need to get to perfect, or whatever. But essentially, what I'm saying is practicing on a track, just doing hot laps or whatever, is not what I'm talking about in the sense of repetition. Because in theory, GT Sport is actually the most quote unquote repetitive in that aspect to a degree, because GT Sport is the most competitive styled game. Meaning there's the FI events. People are purposely trying to be competitive more so than ever in this game, because unlike some other online oriented things in Gran Turismo history, like seasonal events, it's more than just a leaderboard showing rankings. You actually get ranked against other people that you physically race against, so therefore it's that much more important, especially for the highest of the high end of people who get to go to tangible events and all that. So that's not really what I'm going to feature in this video. I may do something on that in the future if y'all want me to, but for now what I'm talking about is just the general overall gameplay other than online lobbies, because essentially those have stayed relatively the same since the start of Gran Turismo Online that had online lobbies. Sort of by default, GT Sports online lobbies are less repetitive in the sense of overall having less tracks and cars. And while I'll mention that some in this video, that's not the main focus either. The main focus is the rotation of the online events. Meaning, in GT Sports sakes, it's essentially the FIA races and the daily / now weekly races. And there's the other games too, which I will ultimately review in chronological order and then give my overall opinion at the end. To start out, the beginning of Gran Turismo Online is kind of sort of GT4. That didn't really count. I think there were a select few people who got some GT4 discs that had online capabilities, and those were extremely rare, so I don't know the exact details on them. So I'm not going to analyze that, but maybe y'all can look that up for yourselves. But what I will start with is Gran Turismo 5 Prologue. This came out in 2008, and the way its events were laid out, from what I can remember, honestly, this was literally about half my life ago. The game came out when I was about 10 years old, 20 years old now, so maybe not the best memory, but I still played it a decent amount. I wasn't all that good at it, but I played it. And from what I can remember, Gran Turismo 5 Prologue had events set up sort of like today's sport mode. More so the daily / weekly races and the FI races, but some races I remember in particular is there was Nissan Skyline versus Fairlady Z, 370Z, 350Z, whatever, at Daytona. There weren't tons of cars in GT5 Prologue. That was one of the races I remember in particular. And then I think another one was supercars. I can't remember the exact category, but like a Nissan GTR, Dodge Viper, Chevy Corvette Z06, the C6 there, could enter it, and it was at High Speed Ring. I remember those two were races in the event. Now, what I can't remember exactly in detail is if the events rotated or not, but essentially, the events were formatted in a way that it didn't really have tons of variety because GT5 Prologue couldn't allow for it. There was only 100 and something cars, and even less tracks than GT Sport had at launch. So, well, again, I said cars and tracks weren't the main focus of the game. Honestly, it's hard for me to fully focus on GT5 Prologue because the online wasn't its main focus back then. It barely had it, honestly, and it was ultimately just a prologue in the first place. So, I know at the very beginning of the video I'm doing something pretty vague, but GT5 Prologue in general is kind of vague. Especially, too, because I think even the point when online started, there's already a cheat code in which you can unlock all the cars. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but you can easily look that one up. I know I remember I did that as a kid anyway, so ultimately I already had all the cars for all the events. And from what I remember, multiple events did run at once. So really, since there was no rating system back then, you could just run whatever event you wanted with no more consequences. I do remember there was somewhat of a penalty system back then. Like I remember specifically at Daytona, if you cut the dog legs, aka the going into the actual start finish line and slightly beyond the area, you got a certain time penalty. I can't remember the exact amount, but I do remember that was a thing. So there were penalties. So ultimately, fairly vague verdict for Gran Turismo 5 Prologue is online was pretty repetitive, but it kind of had to be given the game itself. But for the very first implementation for everyone could use online in Gran Turismo, it was as good as it could be given the circumstances. Next along the lines is Gran Turismo PSP. It was the first game to implement something like a performance point system, which we saw somewhat after the release of Gran Turismo 5. I cannot remember exactly when Gran Turismo 5 got a performance point system, but I remember it was not there at release. But from what I do remember, GTPSP did have sort of a performance point system at release. And its online was... you could pretty much just run any car at any track and then just hope people show up. Honestly, I remember GTPSP had online, but I never played it. And by the time I even looked at it, no one was left. So, also pretty vague, but the overall online for GTPSP was as the game was. You could just do whatever car and track combination you wanted, and that was it. There was really no true events, there's really no true structure to it. It's just you open a lobby and you ran it, and it was essentially open lobby, but not completely because the game itself did its format in a different way than other Gran Turismos. So I would rate GTPSP's online variety as pretty good, but pretty weird. So aka better in GT5 Prologue and is going on the right track. Next is GT Academy, which is a pretty vague term. GT Academy ultimately ran for roughly 10 years or so. I'm going to talk about GT Academy through 2015, but technically it ran more later than that. Just I think the last one that every region got was 2015 from what I recall. But I do remember it started in 2008. Specifically, I'm surprised I actually remember this one as in good detail as I do, but the first one, I think I'm right on this, even though that was quite a while ago now, was Nissan 5070/Fairlady Z at Indianapolis Road Course, and that was the entire GT Academy. It was essentially just a PS3 demo type thing. Like how you download PS3 demos from the PlayStation Store, you did that with GT Academy. To an extent, it kind of was a demo. The reason I didn't put it first is because I can't remember exactly when in 2008 it came out. It may have been after GT5 Prologue. It may have been before. Can't remember for sure. Some point in 2008, just like GT5 Prologue, to an extent released in 2008. But I think another reason it also released 2007, so both of those are kind of vague, but ultimately I put GT Academy where I did now because it ran a lot later than the lifespan of GT5 Prologue and GT PSP. So ultimately, the very first GT Academy was extremely no variety because it was just one event. But it was the very start. Onwards, it did slowly increase throughout the years, and the next one I remember more in detail was between 2011 and 2012. Both of them actually offered quite a bit of variety, given that it was the Nissan GT Academy, so it was just Nissans in the game. But specifically, I remember some of the events in those was a Nissan Silvia, aka not at all a new car, I think it was the 2002 model, at Special Stage Route X. Yes, folks, one of the GT Academy events was doing an easily full throttle turn at a fake track, giant oval, in a non-relevant car in the year 2012-ish. AKA the car is 10 years old, out of production. Still an event though. And there was something like a Nissan Leaf, yes, new car, but it was at a full throttle turn at Cape Ring. If y'all remember Cape Ring, it wasn't the overall best, most luscious looking of the Gran Turismo exclusive tracks. It was one of my least favorite looking tracks. It was okay to run, but it looked kind of as a blah. Still an event though, still quite a bit of variety. And then you had normal stuff too, like you raced your Nissan GTR, and at the beginning, more times you raced the Skyline, because even though the Skyline wasn't that much in production, it's pretty much a Gran Turismo stable. It's hard to deny that. But there was also the 1994 Skyline that was off too, and then of course the main stable that was from the beginning to the very end, the Nissan Z. It was in there too. The later years, I remember the last ones for Gran Turismo 6 now moving to it. There was the Nissan 370Z at Apricot Hill, which was a nice addition because Apricot Hill was actually a later download in the game itself. It didn't come at release, so that was cool. And then the final GT Academy event that I think everyone got to participate in, it wasn't more region locked, was the Nissan GTR LMP, meaning the front wheel drive one, at Le Mans, at Les Arts. So ultimately, just LMP at Le Mans. So that makes sense. And well, what a way to end. That was... No, that's not variety, that's easily predicted. But all things considered, after having a Silvia at a giant oval and a Leaf going full throttle, having an LMP at LM makes sense to end it off with. So overall, I would rate GT Academy as quite a varied experience. It had some ups and downs through the years and ultimately ended on a down. It just ended with a fizzle. That's why I'm not even talking about the last year or two, because I couldn't even physically participate in it because it wasn't in the US, but it did have some pretty good variety. Next game to feature, again, not perfectly chronological because Nissan GT Academy started before and ended later, but the next thing I want to talk about is Gran Turismo 5. Its initial online was kind of meh, and actually this video is over, so I'll move to something else, because why not? It started out pretty much just with the online lobbies, but over time, it did get pretty complex and diverse. We got Sulfur Racing, and it improved over time with miscellaneous updates and stuff, and the damage changed some and all that, and that was nice. That's the only time Sulfur Racing has been featured in a Gran Turismo game. And then we also received seasonal events, meaning races that were made throughout time that were kind of sort of seasonal. Like I remember some of them was near when it happened, February-ish. NASCAR's at Daytona, or near when it happened-ish. LMP's at Le Mans, but a lot of the races, honestly, were pretty random. But they were nice to have. And another edition that was nice to have, too, was time and drift trials. Essentially, those were just do the best you can on a leaderboard, and then go for the gold medal, get the money and prizes, and then just try to move up the leaderboard if you want. There's no prize for getting certain high on the leaderboards, but it was still nice to do too. And just overall, the events were varied for quite a while. GT5 had a lot of cars, a lot of tracks, and a lot of variations to a point in time. I cannot remember the exact point in time, but I do remember starting in Gran Turismo 5, all of the seasonal events, meaning the races, the time, and the drift trials, started to repeat. Self racing itself wasn't an event, it was a mode, so that didn't really repeat, but it also quit getting additions along the way too. Like how Gran Turismo 5 had DLC, added cars and such. This eventually, as the DLC faded, new stuff Shuffle Mode by default also faded because, well, it didn't get the new cars and tracks, because the game in general didn't. And that obviously hurt the time drift and races as well in the seasonal events, but the main issue there was those were literally on repeat. A specific example that I remember in Gran Turismo 5 was there was a specific drift trial that was any rally car at Toscana, the rally track, the dirt one. And there was a loophole in it, in which you could do the back and forth drift type thing that was honestly kind of cheesy. Not really gonna deny that one. I've said that many times before. On videos since about 2015, videos since 2015, on GT Planet since 2013, and on Gran Turismo 5 and onwards in 2011. I'm not gonna deny that. That was sort of BS. But ultimately, that did affect variety a bit in the drift trials, but ultimately, time drift and races started to repeat. Such as the example I gave, a drift trial being any rally car at Toscana that happened at least twice. So I remember the first time around I was meh at it, and the second time around I was 11th in the world at it. That's literally the first one that I learned the drifting quote-unquote technique. So that was that. GT5 started out extremely varied, especially compared to previous titles, but ended on repeat. Not the best, but on the whole, GT6 game on GT5 still had online. So GT6 had something new while GT5 was on repeat, in case people still wanted to close out GT5 on stuff they liked, do whatever they liked while that game still had online, while the new stuff was in GT6. So you could start with that experience as well. GT6 as well started pretty cotton pig and varied. The first events were actually extremely varied to the point of some people actually couldn't even run them. The very first Gran Turismo 6 time trials featured the 15th anniversary cars, which were a specific package that could be pre-ordered. Honestly, that was kind of BS. I don't know why they did that to begin with. I guess they were trying to make sure people got the extra stuff and pre-ordered and all that, but still, it's sort of kind of some shady marketing to, at the very first events of the game, only allow certain people with certain cars to do them. That's iffy. But nonetheless, there's no denying it was varied. It was varied in a very convoluted way. But anyway, the first one that I can remember, I think it might have been the first one completely, was 15th anniversary cars at 500 performance points. I think that's right. At Brands Hatch Indy Circuit. And actually, that particular event I think I finished about 200th in the world in. That's a side note, so I can brag. I'm not even going to deny that one. But, truism. GT6 started out varied, but it did not start out with drift trials in those seasonal events. Those were added to a few months later, so that was kind of annoying. But something that it did have that was new was it actually had online quick matches, which were sort of kind of the quote-unquote replacement for Shuffle Racing because it didn't have that. But as I said, Shuffle Racing is a mode, quick matches are events. Those got updated on a regular basis at the same time the rest of the seasonal events did too. Again, to a point. There was no Shuffle Racing at all in GT6. And the time drift races plus the new quick matches quit getting truly new events after a while. They started being on repeat as well. Both in GT5 and GT6, there was no pattern when it was on repeat, but the events were repeated. Specific example for Gran Turismo 6 being 500 performance point race car time trial at Laguna Seca. One of the events, I finished about 250th in the world. The other event, I finished 29th in the world, the highest ever finish I had in a time trial in Gran Turismo 6. And technically Gran Turismo history because now we're to GT Sport. GT Sport doesn't have time trials. GT Sport doesn't have drift trials. GT Sport doesn't have self-racing. GT Sport doesn't have quick matches. GT Sport has sport mode. Yes, the circuit experiences and the driving school and the missions have leaderboards. With those, you get new events just when you get new cars. So ultimately, the only thing that truly changed there is the circuit experience. The rest of that stays the same. And the circuit experience is basically a one-time thing. It's not a true event, it's just an addition. The main draw of GT Sport is sport mode, which has initially daily races, which were quite varied, especially given the lower car and track count in GT Sport. When the game started, it did all it could with what it had. And what it had was something quite innovative. If iRacing wasn't a thing. Yes, folks, there's kind of no denying. GT Sport daily races is kind of just iRacing, but without a paywall. Paywall came later, but that's not what I'm getting into in this video. GT Sport has microtransactions now, even though they promised it wouldn't. What I will mention is daily races were cool. They were innovative. As we got new stuff to the game, they were pretty quickly implemented into the daily races. Like generally, within a few days after we got a new track, a new car, at least one of the daily races featured a new track and car. Then, not too far into the game's lifespan, less than a year in fact into the game's lifespan. Yes folks, less than 1 year. They weren't daily races anymore. They weren't every 2 days, not every 4 days. They reset every week. Now they're weekly races. And a bit later too in the lifespan, they're essentially on repeat too. Just like in previous Gran Turismos. Except previous Gran Turismos had more than just one mode. The only time weekly races that are now only 1/7 of the amount of time aren't on repeat is if we get a new car and track, which only happens every month or so. And then that's like sort of iffy too, because sometimes it's not immediately implemented. Sometimes we get that new car and track in a weekly races quite a bit later than a few days. But, on with this. Gran Turismo Sport does have FIA races. And that's Gran Turismo Sport's savior from not being the least varied of Gran Turismo Sport's online gameplay. Because I really don't think, I may be wrong about this and I hope I ain't, but I don't think GT Sport's FIA races really could be on repeat. Because those are for tangible things. You can get your driver rating and sportsmanship rating up, obviously, in daily races that are now weekly races. But sport mode is what gets you to the tangible events. By you, I mean the general GT Sport population. That's 0.01% of it that gets there. But all of the GT Sport population can try to get there. So therefore, the events in theory can't really repeat to give a fair field of drivers who do get there. The same events are on repeat, the same drivers are most likely going to get there. We've changed around events. Some drivers are better with certain cars and tracks, so therefore you get new drivers at the events. Some drivers are just incredible and will get there anyway, but having a different variety of events, we're allowed to an extent a different variety of drivers, and that makes the overall variety of Gran Turismo Sport not bad. Because while the weekly races are some of the worst implementation of about any Gran Turismo with online gameplay, the FI races are some of the best, especially given the game's parameters of not the most cars or tracks either. So overall, in conclusion, I would rate GT Sports online gameplay lower than Gran Turismo 5 and 6, but better than the rest. GT Sport PSP and GT5 Prologue were early on in Gran Turismo's online lifespan and were the worst, but obvious reason why it was early on. GT Academy started meh and ended pretty badly, but it was pretty good in the middle, so overall I'd rate about average. GT Sport is slightly above average, especially given the game's car and track count, but it has a pretty bad point in weekly races and a pretty good point with FI races, and then GT5 and 6 were roughly equal because those went off-seasonal events. Plus, each had their own specific mode. GT5 had sofa racing, GT6 had quick matches. So those pretty much equal out and are roughly tied for first. So there we have it, folks. Is Gran Turismo Sport truly repetitive? If you're considering cars and tracks as the main factor, yes, but we knew this from the very start. All things considered, through all the updates and such the game has gotten, GT Sport, I will say this, is probably less repetitive than I was thinking it would be in early 2018, but sort of kind of more repetitive than I thought it was going to be in early 2017. Take that as you may, especially going through previous iterations of reviews I've had through the game. Ultimately, I'll say this. It could be worse, but I wouldn't really expect it to be worse either, because the only thing worse than GT Sport are games that released a whole heck of a heap before it. Now comes Gran Turismo 7 on the horizon. So looking like that's going to happen. Let's hope it goes with the trend of GT number games of late, and has pretty good variety. Let's hope it also takes a trend from GT Sport, and has its main mode not on repeat. If that all happens, that's most definitely worth a yeehaw.